Good morning, guys. Good morning. Good morning.
Oh, good God.
Good morning. And happy post Martin Luther King Day and happy pre-inauguration day. And let's thank God for the gift of learning Torah together. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato, Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah. So what we're doing today are the first 6 pillars of the caste system that Isabel Wilkerson had shared in part 3 of her book, pages 100 to 150. And before I get started, I wanted to frame the class. First, I just wanted to elicit some general reactions to those pillars and what struck you about those pillars. And then for the Jewish pairing, I wanted to ask you to think about if you think that what she says in this book is true. If you think that what she says in this book is true, what impact does that have on your sense of the American story? Rabbi Sachs, may he rest in peace, in his commentary on Parshat Bo, which is this week's portion. So this is the portion where we have plagues 8, 9, and 10. This is the portion where we have the Exodus. We finally get out of Egypt. And this is the portion where God says to us, you have to tell the story. We have a story. You have to tell the story. And that's why we have Pesach. And that's why we have the Seders, to tell our story. And you'll see when we get there that Rabbi Sachs's lesson, his life-changing lesson, is know your story, because the story told across the generations is a gift. When you know who you are and why, you can navigate the wilderness of time with courage and confidence. And he asks you to think about 3 questions that any story should answer. Who am I? Why am I here? How shall I live? Who am I? Why am I here? How shall I live? And the question I want to ask you to connect Rabbi Sachs's portion and Isabel Wilkerson's cast is, if you buy what she says, if you think it's true, then does that have an impact on the story that you tell about our country? Does that have an impact on how you would answer those 3 questions? So first, that's our agenda. So I want to first start by asking some general reactions. What did you think when you read these first 6 pillars? What are some comments, thoughts, and reactions? Anybody? We'll start with any comments. Dottie. And please unmute, Dottie.
Can you hear me?
I sure can. Thank you.
When I read that, I was horrified. Some of the background I know, but one of the things that she quotes, which really threw me, for our United States, 1933, when all those Germans, Nazis got together, they looked up to us. To me, this was the cradle of liberty. I knew there was difficulty in the South. I've known that for years, but not the way that she expressed it and the story she told. But they felt that the Germans felt the United States were a couple of centuries ahead of us. I cannot believe the brutality that went on here. That bothered me so. Do you think, as a rabbi, that this will ever stop? It's like we're fighting the Civil War, and the Indians. It makes us no better than some of the oppressors in the other countries, starting from the Red Indians. They did away with so many and put them on the reservation and all that. And then with the story of the Blacks, it's pathetic. It is sad.
So
and I wonder, and I just wonder if those supremacists in Washington today, they must be children, grandchildren of these people who don't understand freedom and liberty.
Yeah, so Dottie, there's, right, so that's a great question. Here, I want to respond to your question and then take other people's comments, but Micha Goodman in his talk on Sunday about his book, The Wandering Jew. He says very often in Jewish history, there's a battle between two different ideas, and this friction between these two different ideas will eventuate in a particular conflict. And I think the meta battle of the meta ideas in America are very simple. One is all people are created equal. Every person of every color and race and gender is created equal, right? That's one beautiful idea of America. The other in the Constitution is blacks are 3/5 of a person. Blacks are not in the Constitution. Blacks are not a whole person. Blacks are 3/5 of a person. If you you could read These Truths that Jill Lepore wrote, came out a couple of years ago about the Constitutional Convention. Blacks are not equal. Blacks are 60% of a person, according to the Constitution. And so there's two different ideas. One is every citizen is equal. And the other idea is actually whites are on the top of the pecking order, and people of color, especially blacks, are in the bottom caste. They're the mudsill, to quote that senator from South Carolina. And I think these two ideas are in tension with each other, which means, Dottie, that I think here's a question, a meta question I want to ask you. I mean, I grew up, my kids grew up. I used to tell them something that I would never tell them today. I mean, when Nat, Sam, and Jordana were growing up and I was putting them to bed and we were talking and we were in the car and we were having the kinds of conversations parents and children have, I always said to my kids, kiddos, the United States of America is the greatest country in the history of the world. Mm-hmm. It is the greatest country in the history of the world. And I would then talk about how Jews were discriminated against and persecuted and massacred in Europe. But when they came to America, your grandparents and great-grandparents could finally see the land of the free, right? Yeah. I would never tell them that today. Never tell them that today, as they've pointed that out to me, because that is half the story. That's half the story. The other half of the story is blacks are lesser. Blacks are on the bottom caste. Blacks are the mudsill. And I think that's an important part of the story I never got. And so a question I want to ask you, Dottie, is what story of our country do you tell? We're the greatest country in the history of the world, in which case the answers to the three questions, who am I, why am I here, how should I live, is one thing. Or if you say, well, we're living a conflict. There's the idea that everybody's created equal, and there's the reality of the mudsill, in which case those three questions are very different, have different answers. So yes, I think it is horrifying, and it forces us to ask ourselves hard questions. Other responses to we'll dig a little bit deeper into some of the particular ones, but any general reactions to these first 6 pillars of caste? Paul Kalis.
I personally am as Pollyannish as anyone can be.
I agree.
And I do believe that the United States is the greatest nation ever conceived on this earth. But the problem we have now is we have to admit that we have flaws. And those flaws are tremendous. And part of our problem is so many people just cannot admit that we have these problems. And then we had politicians in Washington that emphasized the negative aspects. And I think, I pray, and I don't pray that often, I hope that the new administration will prove that we are truly the greatest nation that ever formed.
Yeah. In other words, Paul, what I hear you saying is that the idea of America, the promise of America, is sublime and beautiful, perhaps uniquely so, that people can come from all over the world and thrive here. I used to grow up thinking about that was the hyphen, the miracle of the hyphen. Irish Americans and Italian Americans and Polish Americans and Jewish Americans, and whatever your hyphen, you could thrive because this is the land of the free. That's the idea. And her book is pointing out that idea, there's a gap between that idea, that ideal, and the reality. And the question is, are we going to shore up the gap between those two?
I
And
think
that requires acknowledging that there's a gap and not denying that there is a gap.
I personally believe that we have to start eliminating the hyphen. That hyphen creates different groups, and different groups have different needs. And I agree when a previous president said, we're not red, we're not blue, we're American.
Mm.
So emphasizing the hyphen emphasizes the problems.
Okay, Paul, thank you. Gail Levine. And you're on mute, my friend. Can you unmute? So Gail, well, if you'll figure out how to unmute, and then I'd love to hear you. Okay, while you're working on that, I'll take David Kopelman and then Linda, and then Gail, hopefully you'll be able to unmute. David.
Yeah, I think there's still a difference between Germany and Egypt and the United States. I think that, you know, we've made a lot of progress in America, and people tend to ignore it. We read about what Abraham Lincoln did in the Emancipation Act, the Civil Rights Movement, the Fair Housing Act, the Equal Employment Act, Brown versus the Board of Education, the desegregation of America. That's all great progress. Now, if you compare it to Nazi Germany, they made no progress in their annihilation of the Jews. They were finally defeated, and that's what happened. Same with the Egyptians. There was no enlightenment by the Egyptians saying, look, this isn't fair. These people are slaves. They deserve a fair wage. They fought, they escaped, and they formed their own lives, ultimately Israel. So this is a story of redemption, I think, in the United States. And people tend to look back at the dispossession of the Indians, the Native Americans, slavery, segregation. They don't look forward to acknowledge the progress that's been made. It's been wonderful progress. We've made progress that the Egyptians never made, or the Germans never made, except when they were defeated. So that's something that I think is good to focus on the progress that we've made, instead of looking back and saying how terrible we were and beating ourselves. We should be somewhat congratulating the fact that we've made wonderful progress. Anyway, that's my.
So David, let me thank you. I think that's a really important point, David. It's a really important point, and thank you for bringing it up. I have a question though for you about the progress. If you were charting this out, do you feel that the progress, and who could argue that we've made progress? Of course I've made progress. But would you say that our progress has been a straight line of progress? Or would you say it's more zigzag, start, stop, start, stop, start, stop, start, stop? And in that regard, I just want to mention two words: Charlottesville and the insurrection. So you can talk about progress. I mean, we don't own blacks anymore, and we don't lynch blacks anymore, and Jim Crow is not the law of the land anymore. That's progress. But what do you do with Charlottesville, which is very 2000 and whatever year that was, 17 or 18? And what do you do with the insurrection, which was an all-white mob, which was just 2 weeks ago? How does that factor into your progress narrative?
Well, I agree that the zigzag, but as to quote Martin Luther King, didn't he say something about the arc of justice is slow, but it does ultimately bend toward righteousness or justice? Right. So I think that's what happened. Yeah, there's zigzag. There's the neo-Nazi group, but they're not dominant. They don't control the government. The government resists. So that's something we should look at. The neo-Nazis is horrible, but they're not they're not large in numbers. Frankly, to be honest with you, I'd be more fearful of what's happening on the far left. For example, in terms of it being a Jew. On the far left of the BLM, the anti-Semitism that exists there, the BDS movement, to boycott Israeli products. I'm more fearful as a Jew of persecution or negativism coming from the left than I am from the right. I think they're smaller numbers.
Okay, so again, David, I mean, I think you raise a very important point about black anti-Semitism, left anti-Semitism, BLM. I don't discredit that. I think those are serious issues. I've spoken about that, given sermons about that before. I agree, but I want to just stick with the point about this tension between progress and zigzag. And I want to ask you the following question about progress. And I want to offer a hypothesis, and I want to ask you if you agree or disagree with my hypothesis. So this morning I was listening to NPR that reported, I don't know if it's true, but this is what NPR reported, that 70% of the Republican Party today believes the election was stolen, including, several senators and including a lot of congressional Republicans. 70% think that it was stolen, 7-0, okay? This despite the fact, right, and there can be no doubt about this, that all of the institutions of our democracy, like courts, like election officials, and ultimately even the Supreme Court, said there was no evidence of fraud, right? So 50 courts or 60 courts said no evidence of fraud. The underlying Secretary of State and the election workers, who are just American citizens, said no evidence of fraud. And many of these officials, like the Secretary of State of Georgia, are Republican. Many of the judges were appointed by President Trump. And ultimately, the Supreme Court, with 3 Trump appointees and a solid right majority, did not intervene. Okay, so all the institutions of our democracy have spoken and said no fraud. Okay, and also President Trump's own security expert, of cybersecurity, said it was the most secure election. His own Attorney General William Barr said there was no evidence of fraud. Right. So his own administration, cybersecurity, Attorney General, no fraud. Okay. And yet today, 70% say fraud. Here's my hypothesis, right? I don't think it's about, and this gets to Dottie's story about our narrative, I don't think that they actually really believe that the machines were changing votes from one candidate to another. I think at bottom, what they're saying is, it's not okay that Black people get to decide who's my president, right? And those fraudulent votes were Black voters in Detroit. Those fraudulent votes were Black voters in Philadelphia. Those fraudulent votes were Black voters. And I don't want Black voters telling me who my president is. And that's the quote unquote fraud. It's not about ballots or missing ballots or defective machines. It's about, I don't want Black people dictating who's the president. That's the fraud. That's why we should stop the count, because all the Blacks were sending in their ballots by mail, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Do you agree with that, David? Or what do you think is going on? How do you explain that today, 70% of Republicans think the election was stolen when the institutions of government say it wasn't?
Well, again, looking at the brightest side, I mean, this country did elect a Black president not once but twice. So, and nobody raised the issue of defective ballots and the election stealing. He was elected legitimately. And
yeah,
so
but
that's
birther. But there were millions of Americans that followed the conspiracy theory that he was not born in America, the birther movement.
Which was ultimately discredited, and the birther movement was raised when he was elected the first time. It didn't move voters to repudiate him on his second election run.
Right. Okay.
So
all I'm saying is,
it didn't gain traction. The birther movement never gained traction, and that's to the credit of the country. They reelected him.
So all I want to say, and this comes back to Dottie's question about what do we do? I think you're absolutely right. There is a narrative of progress and there is a narrative of equality. But I think there's a counter narrative of resistance to progress and a counter narrative of caste. And I think our role begins in the breach between these two narratives, which that tension is still alive today. Linda Leffert, and then hopefully Gail Levine, if you can unmute. Linda.
Well, I think that there's a big difference between the caste system and Negroes and the other issues, for 2 reasons. First of all, the Negroes came to the United States or wherever they came as slaves. Okay, so not only, so 2 things result from that. One is that you just automatically think they're lesser. And the other part is that they're easily identifiable and can be assimilated. I mean, I'm reading another book for another book club that talks about some of these issues too. So some of the information may be from there. But the point was, when there was white immigrants from other places, you know, there were Polish Americans, there were Irish Americans, but eventually they became Americans. And that can't happen to someone who's Black.
That's Wilkerson's book. That's she points that out.
Yeah, okay. So therefore, I think that you have a whole different set of issues when you're talking about, I mean, there are white people in castes as well and subject to some of these issues, but it's always going to be different for the Negroes. I think the part of the fact of how they originally started is going to make it really harder. In terms of this book and what I knew before and what I learned, I would say that I had no idea that about some of the indignities and horrible things that were done to Negroes before I read this book. And I actually certainly wasn't as aware that lynchings were a big publicity party weekend event. But I'd love to feel that I was optimistic about what's happening. The one, just to answer your original question, of the things she mentioned, I guess I wasn't aware that of the first one, that it came from God. That
Yeah,
and
we
I
have to
think
talk
that-
about that.
yeah, I think that's interesting because like God knew that the Americans were gonna that settlers were gonna bring slaves and that they would, you know, so that I didn't know. And
Yeah,
for
so we
the-
have to talk about that. We have to talk about the use and misuse and the use and abuse of religion. That was her first tenet. The first pillar was exactly that. I'll come back to that. Gail, if you can unmute, we'd love to hear you, and then Maddie after that.
Can't do it.
Yes, you can. You're perfect.
Okay, it's amazing what a new battery in your mouse can do. What I wanted to say is reading the book made me realize that we are a generation in this class that really grew up ignorant of what was going on in the country. We are product of parents who lived through the Depression and the war and the Holocaust. And I think that's what they were very focused on. And reading this book is so eye-opening because I'm totally naive about what went on in the South, and it was never discussed at home. What was discussed was being Jewish, even though I didn't come from a religious family, but how lucky we were to be here. And I think that tenet has really pervaded our lives. And the other parts of how people suffered in other parts of the country or what they were living through was very much overshadowed in our growing up.
Gail, I so appreciate that comment. I think it's so true for so many of us. It's so true for me. Here's my question to you, Gail Levine. What do you now do in this season of your life? You're having grown up with a narrative of America as the golden Medina, America as the exceptional country, America as the land of the free, America is the greatest country, which was true for Jews who could pass as white. Jews could pass as white, and many did, right? And now you read like this whole other story. And by the way, not just the South. The discrimination, the caste system followed them to the North, right? What do you now? So you've lived one reality. You've kind of internalized with your mother's milk one reality, and now you're reading this and you're realizing, oh my God, it wasn't an aberrational, hard, sad chapter that ended in 1865, but it's a basic thread in the tapestry of our country. It's a whole counter narrative. What do you do with that? How do you integrate those two different narratives now?
Well, it's a cultural outlook that I have to really change direction. And I hope I'm grown up enough to do that, to open my eyes to realize what's really been going on here. As I said, we grew up in such an idealistic, lily white environment that I had no conception of this. So it's a whole new path to go down.
Yeah. I really appreciate that, Gail. Maddie.
Yeah, I just I wanted to mention something about that 70% that you mentioned before, Wes. It was based on a very small sample. So there is some question as to how accurate that number is. Was based on a sample of a little over 1,000 people. But I also want to mention that I really think that the second group that's right behind Blacks are the Jews. And I think that Jews are being blamed. We are the quote, David may refer to them as the far left, but Jews are lumped together with that far left group that's right behind the Blacks. And we tend to be blamed. And I worry about that equally as much now. The situation in Georgia, where Purdue's campaign reimagined Ossoff's image with a large nose to depict him as the lecherous Jew. And what I found about this book, Caste, I found it very interesting that she kept comparing the fate of Blacks to the fate of Jews. And she kept talking about how similar our situations were. So I thought that was interesting because we're being blamed a lot now for things that I specifically think about how we supported the Black movement in the 60s, how Rabbi Heschel walked with Martin Luther King, how Michael Bonin's father walked with Martin Luther King, and now we're being blamed for so much. It was refreshing to me in some ways that she was able to sadly show those comparisons, that there's a bond somewhere between Blacks and Jews.
Maddie,
But
I want to follow up on that point. I mean, one of the essential qualities of her book is exactly as you just said, almost a seamless continuity between America's treatment of the Blacks and Germany's treatment of Jews. America and Blacks equals Germany and Jews. And in the same chapter, in the same pillar, she will just go back and forth like bilingually. The Jews, Blacks, America, Nazi Germany, America, Nazi Germany. And my question to you is, does that work for you? Do you think that that's true? Is it offensive? What's your emotional reaction to basically a moral equivalency, right? She's drawing very deliberately a moral equivalency between how the Jews were treated by Nazi Germany is morally the same as how Blacks have been treated by America. What do you think of that?
I applaud her for doing that. The difference is that what happened to the Jews in Germany happened within a relatively short period of time, and then people think it was fixed. In reading this book, we see that it started a very long time ago for the Blacks, and it continues right up until today.
Right.
So the difference is the timing, but the impact seemed to me an important one. And I was hoping that more Black people might read her book and see that comparison and see us more as an ally rather than an enemy.
By the way, just a program note that I met on Friday, virtually, of course, with Jeremy Battle, who is the pastor of Western Avenue Baptist Church. And we're working on a series of 4 Tuesday nights where his church, which is a Black Baptist church, and our synagogue are going to read Caste, and he'll lead 2 sessions and I'll lead 2 sessions, and Black and white and Jew and Christian can study together. So to try to create dialogue. One of the challenges is on these kinds of Zoom calls, all the faces are white. And what would it look like to have a Zoom call with a whole other community as well? Harriet Mazanski, your hand was up.
Well, you spoke about divine will.
Yes.
And the apartheid government in South Africa was based on divine will.
Yes.
They believed that Black people were subject to the curse of Ham. They believed in the Tower of Babel story, in which they believed that God felt that different nations should be separated from one another. And we grew up with that. Unlike what Gail said, we were very much aware every single day, from the minute we opened our eyes till the minute we closed them, about the injustices inflicted on Black people.
And Harriet, as a woman who had that experience, lived the experience of apartheid in South Africa, and as an observant or a serious observant, pick your adjective, Jew, who gets a lot of meaning and purpose from Jewish sources, how do you deal with the fact that the very first pillar is that God wills Black people to be in the lowest caste, and God wills white people to be above Blacks? That this is God's will. So, I mean, it's obviously just such a deeply offensive misuse of scripture. But to your point, and Isabel Wilkerson brings this out, the curse of Ham is a very common, and has for millennia, justification for whites owning Blacks. So how do you square your lived experience in apartheid with the fact that you aspire to live according to a Torah Jewish life, and yet scripture has been abused in this way? How do you process all that?
Are you asking how I reconcile it?
Yeah, exactly.
It's very difficult for me. When we left South Africa, we came here with rose-colored glasses, and they stayed rosy for quite a long time. And I have to say, no longer are they that rosy. And the best that I can do at the moment is we try to instill the right thing into our children, and we hope they will do so to the grandchildren, and that we will reinforce that as well. But yes, when we came here, we did think this was the greatest country on earth. I still sort of think that, because when I think about going to another country, I can't really come up with somewhere else, but it is deeply flawed.
Yeah.
Deeply flawed.
Yeah. I want to just raise the same issue that, a number of you have now raised, including Harriet most recently, which is the fact that divine will and the laws of nature were used. And how do you process religion being used in this way? Judy Swartz. And Judy, if you can please unmute.
That so bothered me, this divine will business, that I went to Torah and read the Noah story and read the story of Ham. And it was, I kept saying to myself, unless I'm totally crazy, we have never, for all the times I've ever been in show, we have never talked. We've never talked about the three sons delineating that they could possibly be. This one stands for the Asians, this one stands for Europe, this one stands for Africans.
Right.
And it was, I mean, I can't tell you how offended I was by that, and how much it bothered me. I had studied that in another course down here. I also want to say, I also came from a background like Gail Levine's, all right? And my husband is a first generation American, and it was, this is the best country in the world. And we were totally focused on the plight of the Jews coming over to this country, and all the hard work and the miracles, and that this is the gold, this is the land of opportunity for everyone. Then we grew up, and actually enormously, because of my oldest son, Jeffrey, he was very involved when he was running our business with the total community of Boston, and that put him smack with the Black community. And so we got very involved with an organization called City Year. And what an eye-opener of the needs of go into any city and look at their schools, look at their public schools and the conditions they're in, and look at the parks. And so we did loads of days of service, and it was an eye-opener. We did some of this down here in Florida. And so, we don't know how to rectify all that was, but there are all kinds of things that we can do. And the JCRC dreamt up this, you could tutor in the schools. And when I lived in Boston, we used to do those kind of things. And before the virus came along, I used to tutor I mean, I live on the ocean and go in 2 blocks and move, north, and you're talking a very, very poor Black community, of which I used to go there and volunteer with these little kids to teach them how to read. So the injustices are unbelievable and still continue today.
Mm. Thank you, Judy. So, thank you.
We never discussed the story of Noah. We always, in our brain, was saying, compare Noah with Abraham. Noah obeyed. Noah never argued with God.
Right.
That's
Right.
the knee-jerk reaction of what's the story of Noah all about.
So Shai Held, who's a rabbi in New York, as it points out that religions contain multitudes. That's one of his teachings. Religions contain multitudes, and the multitude could be for bad, or it could be beautiful and ennobling. And the curse of Ham is just one of the most shameful episodes. But it is kind of stunning to see that in a completely different tradition, the Hindu tradition of India, they also cite religion as a way of keeping people down. Let me just ask before we pivot to Jonathan Sachs. Did anybody want to bring up any? We read these first 6 pillars. Would love any comments. Cindy Levinson. I think you're raising your hand. Cindy, if you're raising your hand, we would love to hear what you have to say. So Cindy, you know what we're going to do? If you can keep working on unmuting, when you're ready to unmute and I'll be able to see it, then we'd love to call on you. Okay. So you'll work on unmuting and I'll call on you when you're ready. I wanted to ask if anyone, was there any particular passages or stories that she pointed out that, I mean, every page is a revelation, but that was particularly salient to you? Anyone that was particularly salient? Paul.
There is, I've gone a little bit ahead in the book, and there is one line on page 315 that really troubles me, and I'll just read it. It's very brief. In more than half a century since 1964, no Democrat running for president has ever won a majority of the white vote. Now, I was stunned when I read that. Since 1964, no Democratic candidate has won the majority of the white vote. It shows a shift to the right.
Right. And one way, I mean, there perhaps are different ways to read it, but in 2000 and in the wake of President Trump's victory, many people read this book called Strangers in Their Own Land. And it was written by a sociology professor from Berkeley who lived in rural Louisiana, which just went overwhelmingly for President Trump. And the main, and so she goes there, she lives, she's from a different world entirely. And she interviews them and lives in this community. And what she found, the main metaphor of strangers in their own land, is what people did not like about President Obama and what they did not like about America was that people were cutting in line. That was the main metaphor, line cutting. And now I take a look at that metaphor, strangers in their own land. Why are they upset about line cutting? They thought President Obama cut in line. Michelle Obama cut in line. It really pissed them off. What I now get is, I didn't have the language or the infrastructure then, but I do now. That's a caste statement. That President Obama cut in line means he should be he's a mudsill. He should be on the bottom of the bottom caste. And when you have a black person, as president, that's a caste violation, and they're cutting in line. And I think one narrative of the problem that you bring up, Paul, is that, and the reason the nation went from President Obama to President Trump is a counter narrative that we want blacks in their place, which is not the White House. And that narrative, that counter narrative of mudsill, I think is, and perhaps, I don't know if the 70% is accurate or not, it's just what I heard this morning, but this could be a part of our population that really, they might not use this terminology, but a part of our population that likes the caste system and they like blacks in their place. And that's not the White House. Linda, and then I also want to see if anyone is on the other screens. We're asking for other passages or stories that we read today that were particularly salient to you. Linda.
Well, a while back, Trump was, when there was some argument, some criticism of some gerrymandering kind of thing, he said, if everybody voted, the Republicans never could win.
Right.
He said that.
Yeah.
Not flat out. You know, we need to do this because if everybody votes, we're fucked. I mean, he didn't use that word, but sorry,
Right.
I apologize.
Right. But that's why to suppress
it-
the, yeah.
I found it stunning that he would say that so openly and not be, you know, like, oops, I shouldn't have said that.
Right.
I mean, and
What-
so, you know,
yeah.
they're not, I thought personally, you know, although obviously I didn't vote for Trump the first time, I could think of reasons why he might have gotten elected, which I won't bore you with.
Right.
It occurred in my naivete that after 4 years of what he did or didn't do, the result would be different. And the fact that all those things didn't even matter was encapsulated, I think, in, you know, in what I just said, that, you know, these
Right.
people, and I do think it's a caste issue.
Yeah. I want to connect that fact to, I'll tell you what just struck me. I mean, I just could not believe this. This guy, Senator James Henry Hammond of South Carolina. This was in chapter 5 about, you know, the mudsill. Here's a guy who rapes an enslaved woman, and then the daughter born of that rape is his daughter, and he rapes her too. He rapes his own daughter, and then he abuses 4 nieces that he blames for that. And his wife leaves him and then comes back to him. And when all this is out and known, he is elected senator of South Carolina. And in other words, racism, I won't use that word because she doesn't use that word that much. Upholding the caste system. Upholding the caste system really pays in South Carolina. You can rape your own daughter, as he does and was known. You can abuse sexually your own nieces, 4 of them, as was known. Your wife can walk away from you because of that, as was known. But he's the most passionate and articulate spokesman of the mudsill theory. Blacks are the mudsill. And he becomes senator from South Carolina. And I feel like you can draw, this was in 1858. I feel like you can draw a straight line from some of that to some of the electoral trends we've seen in our own life. Connie Gieser.
I think one of the important points that Isabel Wilkerson made is that the caste system does something horrible to all ends of the spectrum. For instance, in this story, the caste system gives this guy permission to do these evil things. Other examples she gave were that the caste system is deprived of enjoying the talents and the leadership qualities, et cetera, of the caste below them, so that everyone suffers.
Right, right. So here's my question. I want to pivot in our remaining time to Rabbi Sachs and his portion on this week. And he alights upon the fact that this is the portion not only of the Exodus, but of the command to tell the story of the Exodus through the Passover Seder. And he says, why is it so important for every generation to tell the story? Page 78, that narrative provides the answer to the three fundamental questions every reflective individual must ask at some stage in their lives. Who am I? Why am I here? And how then shall I live? And then he says, I'm going to just quote at the very end, the greatest gift we can give our children is not money or possessions, but a story, a real story, not a fantasy, one that connects them to us and to a rich heritage of high ideals. And then he goes on to say that know your story, because the real story told across the generations is a gift. So here's my question. If you were talking to, a young grandchild who said, Papa or Nana, tell me about America, what story would you tell them? We know Pesach is March 27th, so it's coming around. I don't know if it will be Zoom or in person. Who knows? That's in God's hands. But when you talk to your grandchildren about this country, and Rabbi Sachs charges us specifically, a real story, not a fantasy, one that connects them to us and a rich heritage of high ideals. What story do you tell them? And how do you help your grandchildren process those three questions? Who am I? Why am I here? And how shall I live? So thoughts, comments, questions. I particularly want to just get if there's any new voices who have not yet spoken, and I'm going to go look around, and I'm going to the second screen. Anyone who has not yet spoken and would like to speak, if I've missed you, please send me a chat, and I would love to call upon you. And otherwise, I'm happy to call on anybody. Susan Kopelman.
I agree with, I'm not a Pollyanna either, but my concern at this point is we have grandchildren. I have a 17-year-old who was out with the movement, Black movement, and can't see anything good about this country now. So I sort of, when you have a narrative, while you can't say this country is everything that it should be, you cannot say that it is. I would still rather be in this country than any other country, especially as a Jew. As a Black person, I might be better off in another country. But the fact remains, you can't take away the ideals and the movement that our country makes in a positive way, even though we don't make it through. And I don't think it's fair to only look at the negative, which is very easy today, and not see that from 1865, we've come somewhere.
So Susan, I couldn't agree with you more, 100%. And to just focus on the negative is a disservice, and it's inaccurate, and it's not helpful. Here's my question to you as a grandmother of a very bright 17-year-old grandchild. Do you feel that you can communicate complexity to your 17-year-old? Can you communicate the high ideals, the idea and the ideals of America, which are sublime and beautiful, and communicate the many ways in which reality is, there's a discrepancy between the reality and the ideals, and then situate yourself and your grandchild with the holy work of trying to shore up the reality so that it meets the promise? I mean, in other words, can you communicate complexity across the generations?
I think when you're careful, you can. It's not so easy to be listened to sometimes. But at other times, as long as you don't push, it's once again, if it don't pull the coat around you tightly, then they tend to listen a little bit. And especially the bright ones are right in a lot of ways. They have major points and things that you can learn from them also. But I think they can learn from Well, I'm not a negative person, and I don't want to look at it like that. And to wipe away the fact that I'm in this country alive because this country has been good to Jews is a foolish thing for my granddaughter to forget also.
Yeah, I agree. One thing that I have learned from this class, from the wise comments, is, you know, as they say, no two kids grow up in the same house. And I think no two generations grew up in the same country. And, you know, the prevailing narrative of our generation is America, the greatest country in the history of the world. America made possibilities for Jews that no other country in evil, horrible Europe ever did. That's 100% true. And that's our narrative, and it's true. It's just not complete.
Right.
And the narrative of our kids and of your grandkids is, oh my God, look at the many ways in which white privilege is, you know, comes at the expense of people of color, et cetera, et cetera. And they're not living, you know, they're no longer so deeply appreciative of the golden Medina. And what their eyes are focused on is the ways in which communities of color have been oppressed. So, and both are true. And the question is, how can we bring both of these narratives in a thoughtful conversation?
You have to grow up to the fact that it's like a father. When you're a little kid, your father is everything.
Right.
I mean, a good father, and he knows everything, and you look up to him. Now, when you get to be 30 years old, forget about 17 or 18, but when you get to be 30 years old, you must recognize that your father isn't quite the perfect man that you thought he was, but that doesn't make him nothing.
Right.
And that's what I'm afraid of. You can't say that, Joe, because the Jews were very comfortable here and we're very thankful and lucky, you can forget about Blacks who have not made the progress they should have.
Right. Thank you, Susan. Other ideas about, yes, Andrea.
I just coming off from Susan's point, I think in talking to my grandchildren for various ages, but with an understanding, I would want to, I find they like to listen to my struggles and my stories. And I think one lesson would be able to say that because things weren't the way you thought they were and are terrible now, doesn't mean that it's nothing. That's a very important lesson, to not let myself go to those extremes. And so when Jonathan Sachs is talking about the importance of Moses, says you must tell to your grandchildren and say, I was a slave in Egypt. And I grew up with Passover seders saying, because we were slaves in Egypt, but did anybody ever talk about the slaves here? That was such a miss. And I would want to talk to my grandchildren about that. You know, we'd go around the table and say, well, in your life, how do you feel enslaved? And, you know, kids would say, too much homework, too many rules, too many. We never talked about what was really going on. And so I would want to start there and then help them absorb it without going to extreme.
Yeah, Andrea, that's just, I think, so powerful. A caste-infused Seder, right? And I think that's just so profound that I can't say anything other than amen. You know, so many of us over the years of our Seders have said, you know, how are you enslaved? Too much homework, running too fast, I'm enslaved to my cell phone, etc. And meanwhile, there really are vast populations of our country that are currently in the mudsill caste in our own time. And we just I never saw, I never looked, I never knew, I never saw. And how do we process that at this year's Seder? I think that's so important. Annette Needle.
Peter and I live in a sorry.
Yeah, you're good. We can hear you.
Peter and I live in a multiracial family. We don't, for years, what you, Wes, just summarized about white supremacy, about the downtrodden, the Blacks, the history, was not put in the framework of caste, but that has been the discussion at the table, whether it's Shabbat or during the week. And I could go into extensive stories about it. And if you tried to bring up progress, they would listen, but you would be stopped and be taken right back to white privilege, white privilege, white privilege. So 2 weeks, and I'm doing it now at the end because 2 weeks ago, as I was lighting the candles on a Zoom call with our kids and grandchildren in their homes, I usually, when I light the candles, begin with some kind of statement about the week, some kind of statement about what's going on. I then go into talking about, losses, deaths, and I could go on. And I wasn't able 2 weeks ago to summarize. I wasn't able to say anything. And I said, I don't have the words, which is unusual for me. And I said, can somebody say it? Our 14-year-old granddaughter, who is Haitian American, said, it's horrible. Did I say it right?
Yeah.
And I didn't hear her. So I asked her to repeat it. And she said it again. And then our son, her uncle, said, wait a minute, we need to stop. And he then described what had just taken place in Georgia in the election. And he said, we've got to figure out a way to talk about both and balance it and how we're going to go forward. Peter and I were in shock. This has not happened before. We have a daughter-in-law who's American-born of Indian parents. We have 3 granddaughters whose father is Haitian. When my sister invited friends to a Thanksgiving meal at our house, she said she had to prepare them, this was a number of years ago, for coming because she thought she was going to her sister, a Jew. And she said, no, you're going to the United Nations. So without putting the rubric of, we haven't had the word caste, but what's described in the book, we have been talking about and hearing about at our table.
Well, thank you so much, Annette. Here's my prayer for us, which is, I think this book is unlike any book that I have ever read because of its power to disrupt settled patterns of how we think. I'll just speak for myself, of how I think. And my prayer is that we can read this book non-defensively and accept its truth and its critique, and then figure out, using our Jewish resources and frame of reference, which is all about tikkun, repair, how to take the lessons of this book and build a better world and build a better country by coming up with some new answers to why I'm here, to how I shall live, and to what I can do, to make this a better country. I think taking a look at those 3 questions through a new light could yield some new answers that could allow us to have an impact on the world. So thank you for a really thoughtful, important conversation. We'll pick up next Tuesday from page 150 to page 200. And stay tuned for some publicity. Would love to have you join our conversation with the Western Avenue Baptist Church on this book. Have a wonderful week, and I'll see you next Tuesday. Thank you.